Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's lecture. Today's lecture is compliance within the land domain. Just like all the previous chapters that we've been doing, we're working through the IT units, parts of the IT department, the domains, and we're going through each one of them and talking about the compliance requirements for those areas and also the types of controls that can be used in those areas. During this chapter, we're going to talk about um, requirements for compliance. We're going to talk about laws. We're also going to talk about business reasons that compliance is good. We're also going to talk about the CIA triad, talk about the policy standards and procedures that you typically find within the land domain. Hey, Robert. We're also going to talk about vulnerability management. Whenever you hear vulnerability management, think of patches, things of that nature. So we're going to be always looking at vulnerabilities inside of our company, and we're going to be working to patch those vulnerabilities or mitigate them. And then at the end, we're going to wrap up with a list of best practices for the domain compliance. So a lot of companies require a network and infrastructure to do their business. Um, there's a lot of different reasons for that. One of them is the ability to share information quickly with colleagues. Another reason we would use networking is to save money on expensive equipment so we can share resources like printers. Networking also allows us to centralize authentication and access control. So instead of having files spread out among computers on a network and allowing end users to share the files, or putting the files on USB or storage devices and walking around with them, we're going to keep all of our files in one place on a server, and then we can strictly control access to those files. So that's some of the reasons why we use networking inside of our businesses. Remember, this is going to be with all of the chapters. One of our chief responsibilities is to protect people's privacy. So when we comply in the land domain, we are going to protect our customers' privacy. We're also going to protect the privacy of the company with maybe proprietary information. And then compliance also is the process of putting these security controls in place, checking to see if they work, and revising the security controls. We're going to talk about the CIA triad later, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. One of the things they will ask you on a certification exam is what is the opposite of the CIA triad? The opposite of confidentiality would be disclosure. The opposite of integrity would be alteration. And the opposite of availability would be destruction. So that is the DAD triad: disclosure, alteration, and destruction. Remember when we're talking about the land domain, We have local resources. A local resource would be something that's directly connected to your computer, such as a printer or a scanner, um, a monitor, things that are plugged directly into your computer. And then we're going to have remote resources, which is a resource that we have to go through the LAN to get to. So you might hear those terms. Things that drive compliance, other things. Um, when you install a LAN into a company, you're going to increase the number of potential users that can access the resource on the domain. Because we have so much access, we're going to have some kind of way to control it. Um, in the past, before we had local area networks, we would control access to the computer itself. If you weren't allowed to get confidential information, you wouldn't be able to use the computer. Now, since everything is networked, we can access that information from almost anywhere. So we have to have these compliance and controls on our network, or it's going to be a free for all. It's going to be a big mess. It's important to control access and monitor LAN activity to ensure controls are doing their job. So again, part of the compliance is checking to make sure that once we put these controls into place, that they are working and they're not being circumvented, bypassed, or defeated. Other things that drive us to have a compliance review or an audit would be PCI. Remember, we have to have additional controls to protect credit card information. PCI DSS is not a law, but a requirement or a standard that is published by the credit card companies. And if we want to continue processing credit cards for payment, we need to follow that standard. HIPAA is also a requirement. HIPAA is a federal law, and it controls access to personal health information and tells us what we have to do to protect it. So these are the reasons why we are spending all of this money and spending all this time putting controls into the network. These are the drivers for those security controls and this monitoring of the network. Again, we're going to be working within a LAN domain. So we've covered the user domain already. We've covered the workstation domain already. So we've done this already. We've already done the workstation domain. Now we're on the LAN domain. Things that we're going to use to mitigate threats, vulnerabilities, and control risk at the LAN level. One of them is going to be access controls. Access controls, remember, come into effect after somebody has authenticated. So they're going to control access to files, control access to printers. And remember, we have many different types of access control systems. So we need to select one for our LAN domain. We need to have those controls in place so we can support our confidentiality. We also need to have communication controls that we can use to, if we have a virus or something going on in the network, we need to be able to shut off portions of the network, be able to control the flow of communication in and out of the network. An example would be a firewall. I'm going to limit somebody's access to my network. I'm going to limit communication. We need to have anti-malware software in all of the computers in the LAN domain to detect and eradicate malware. Remember, malware being a virus, a Trojan, a worm, any unwanted software, and maybe dangerous software. You don't want that on your network. We also need to have recovery plans. Recovery plans support availability. So we need to have recovery plans. We need to have backups for all of the devices in the LAN domain, especially backups and recovery options for our servers where we store all of our information in the network. So we need to have those controls also. Like I said, it supports availability. We need to have change procedures. So anytime somebody makes a change on the network, we are going to kind of capture that action before it happens. We're going to review it and then approve that change, and then the change is going to take effect. So we need to have that control on the network. If we don't, we're going to start to have problems because we have 10 cooks in the kitchen, if you would say. We've got people, the cooks in the kitchen are trying to make soup, and one of them pours salt in the soup, and then the other one thinks the other one didn't pour salt in the soup, so he adds more salt. So you add salt 10, 11 times to the soup till it becomes inedible. So that would be an example of all of these changes. Change control isn't as important when you have one person doing everything. But once you have more than one person doing things, we need to start keeping track of all of that stuff, who did what. It also enforces accountability. So somebody does something without thinking it through and maybe destroys data or takes down the network. We need to make sure we hold that person accountable. Maybe do some remediation, some training. If not, there's no way we can tell what went on or what happened. So we need to have that. We also need to have monitoring tools on our network so that we can tell if the network is still working properly or if we have degraded performance. And that has more to do with availability. Right? We need to know what's going on in our network. We also need to monitor suspicious activity. So think of it that way. Software patch management. We need to keep all our devices up to date. We may have a large array of different types of equipment on a network, and we need to keep all of that software up to date. And if you're working in healthcare, I mean, just imagine you have all of these IoT devices. We've got blood pressure monitors, and we have to, MRI machines. We got to keep the software up on all of that stuff. So that becomes a really big job. But these are the most important controls that we're going to use in the LAN domain. We talked about the user domain, and we talked about it was more policies and procedures and stuff like that. When we get to the LAN domain, we're getting more into logical controls where we're dealing with software and access control systems. So start moving your brain towards that. This isn't necessarily dealing as much with users and writing policies and stuff. This is more of correctly configuring devices. Remember, when we pick these controls, we talked about this last chapter, we don't always just go grab the first control we find. The reason we don't do that is because we have business interest. We need to keep operations running, right? So that's operations. That's the day-to-day running of the company. We need to make sure that our controls do not interfere with the or have the least amount of impact on our operations as possible. An example would be an expensive color printer. So you have an expensive color printer connected to your network. If you've ever printed color, it's probably about $1 a page to print in color. And it gets misused a lot when you install one of those devices on your network. If you can't imagine that, imagine a 3D printer. You buy a 3D printer, it's expensive to maintain all of the, what do they call it? The plastic, the media for the 3D printer. So buying all of this wax or plastic or whatever for your 3D printer. People just are allowed to go in there and print anything they want on a 3D printer. It gets really expensive, right? People are using it for their personal items. One way to stop people from doing that is to put a physical barrier between people and that device. So we're going to put it in a locked room, and only certain people can actually get into the room. So we're only going to allow R&D to use the 3D printer, and only the supervisor of the R&D department has a key to even get in the room. That's really locking everything down. We put a control in place, a policy saying who can get in to use the printer, and we used a physical control mechanism, which was the lock on the door. That approach would solve your printing issue. People wouldn't be printing personal stuff. But it would also not allow most users to use the printer for valid business purposes. So every time I needed to do something or got an idea that would, profit the company, I have to go hunt somebody down to open the door. So restricting access is a good way to keep those costs down, but it comes at the cost of creativity and being able to do things, for work in the organization. In that case, when you lock your printer up in the room, the physical printer, the security controls getting in the way of your business functions. We spent all of this money on a 3D printer so that we could do good things, have ideas with the company and make money. But now we're limiting access to it, and nobody can get to it. So we've kind of wasted our money. Another way to be able to address the problem is limit the applications that can print to the 3D printer, or put access control mechanisms in through Active Directory so only certain people can send jobs to the 3D printer. That would be a much more practical way of controlling access to the printer, because then people that should be able to do it can do it through their permissions. The print jobs would be logged. So I have a print server. I could find out if somebody was abusing it. There would be accountability. And people could still get to the printer. So just think about that when you're putting these controls in place. Some controls will do the job really well, but really, have an impact on your operations. So we want to make sure that we have the most effective control in there. Right? So talking about a LAN. So when we start thinking about a LAN, we have to do that assessment, right? We have to do inventory and figure out what our assets are. What do we need to protect? So these are some of the devices on the network that we need to think about that we need to protect. We need to protect our media. We need to think about what type of media we're using. We need to talk about the devices that are on the network, how they communicate. We need to talk about our servers and also the software that runs on the network. So let's talk about the connection media. You need to know, and you've done this already in CTI 120, Net 125, Net 126, what the different connection media options are. You need to know the advantages and the disadvantages. So we have one type of media called unshielded twisted pair. That's typically what you're going to find when you go into a business. That would be, just regular Ethernet cable. The advantage is that it's low cost. The disadvantage is it doesn't have immunity to interference, and it's easily monitored. Somebody could easily get to that cable and listen to the magnetic emanations from that cable. They can also do other things with that cable. It's not very protected. Shielded twisted pair does better in high interference environments, but like we said before, it's a type of Ethernet cable, like a twisted pair cable, and it's fragile. People can splice it, people can cut it, people can tap it and eavesdrop on it. So UTP and STP are pretty cheap, but we have that problem. Coaxial cable, think of the cable that comes into the back of your cable box at home. We still use coaxial cable for different applications on the network. You don't see it as much in networking, but we still have some wiring out there. Sometimes we use it in high interference environments. Maybe we'll use it on a manufacturing floor because it has a high noise resistance from having interference encroaching on the wire. Coaxial cable is a little bit more expensive, and when we use coaxial, we're going to have a bus topology. So the problems that come into play when we have a bus topology about having the wire cut in one place takes down the whole network. We need to think about stuff like that. Fiber optic is another choice. Fiber optic is immune to noise and interference. Fiber optic's really expensive. The wiring is expensive. The installation, the labor is really expensive. The connectors that go on the end of the fiber are really expensive. The equipment that you use, connectivity devices, are expensive. So fiber optic is the best option for interference, but it's also your most expensive option. So we have to weigh all of those factors. And then we have wireless. Wireless is very flexible, but it's also very dangerous in high security environments. If we're really worried about the information we're sending over the network, we probably don't want to use wireless. So we need to know about these media, connection media, and we need to know about controls that we can use with the different types of media. For example, with wireless, we can use encryption. We need to know the different types of encryption, the WEP, the WPA2, AES, all those different options. We need to become very familiar with that connection media. Unshielded paired, shielded twisted pair. We need to be familiar with the conduit that we can use. We can use raceways. We can use closed conduit to cut down on an interference. So that would be the types of controls we could use with the connection medias, conduits, encryption on our wireless. We also need to know about our connectivity devices, these LAN devices. We need to know how to wire them physically, but we also need to know how they communicate logically. So we have to know that a hub repeats everything it hears. It's a layer 1 device. It doesn't look at addressing. So if I have a confidential piece of email that I'm sending across the network, everybody hears it. Not so much in a switch. Switches work at layer 2. They know about MAC addresses. They filter traffic that is not for you. So my computer doesn't hear every piece of every frame that goes across the network, every piece of information across the network like a hub does. We can also use VLANs on switches. We can segment the network. Remember that when we put a switch in a network, we are creating more collision domains. The more collision domains we have, the better. The smaller the collision domain, the better. So we need to know about that stuff. We need to know about routers. We need to know about broadcast domains. Where is the information that I'm sending out of my routers going to be broadcasted to? I need to know that stuff. I need to know about the routing protocols. Which ones are secure, which ones aren't secure. And once I know about it, I can do things to make it more secure. I can turn on OSPF and I can start putting passwords in there, right? Pre-authentication passwords where I have the password on both sides of on both routers. So when routing updates comes in, I can authenticate it. We also need to know about file servers. We need to know about the hardware that goes into file servers to support availability. We have advanced controls in file servers that we don't find on desktop computers, such as hot swappable hard drives, hot swappable processors, hot swappable memory. So we have all of these different controls we can put in place to make my systems more accessible or available. We already talked about print servers and printers. Network operating systems, we need to make sure that we can have the network operating system support the access control that we want, the access control methods. Just remember, no matter what type of media we choose or LAN devices we choose, it's going to, especially wireless, is going to increase the likelihood that unauthorized users will connect to your network. So I might have Ethernet jacks. Somebody might find an open jack, plug a computer in. It makes it more likely anytime we use a network or a LAN that our information is going to be seen by unauthorized users. So we need to know the controls. We need to put the controls in place in this domain. So once we start talking about devices, we need to think about all of these devices we have on a network. We talked about media. We talked about the network devices such as hubs and switches and routers. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual pieces of equipment that we connect. So in these file servers, remember what we're going to do is centralize all of our files so that our files are not spread out over the network. This allows us to maintain tight control of the files on the network and who has access to them. It also gives me an opportunity to monitor access and log it. So this file server has a lot of benefits. We just need to make sure we put the proper controls in to control information on that network. We still use file servers. Slowly we're moving over to content management systems, which allow us to access the file from anywhere. right? The file server is typically for the LAN. Things like Google Docs are for workers that are on the go that need to access things everywhere. File server allows you to control access to a file. A content management system is going to give you further control, and once they're in the file, what they can do with the file. So think about Adobe Acrobat. So we fire up Adobe Acrobat, and the author can put limitations in there. They can say if you're using an ebook for this class, they have limitations on what you can print. They have limitations on if you can copy and paste. So content management systems allow us to do that. So know about that also, that file servers are still around, but we're also moving to all of this cloud-based stuff. We also have something called a print server. Print server is the gatekeeper to this back-end network with my printers on there. I can control access to those printers and say who can print and when they can print and what they can print. All right. In order to have my network actually work and available so that the legitimate users can use it, I need to make sure that I'm monitoring my network. Some monitoring tools that we can use is a packet sniffer. When you think of packet sniffer, think of Wireshark. That's Wireshark. So if you're a network administrator, that should be in your tool belt. Because without Wireshark, you're not going to be able to figure out what's going on your network. And also, we're going to have monitoring of changes in the network. So when somebody changes settings in a load balancer, that's marked somewhere. In fact, they probably shouldn't be changing it without having the change review committee review his changes before he does it. Like I said, it's okay in a small company. You just make changes to pieces of equipment. When we get into a company that has, hundreds or thousands of switches across the network, one little change you make is going to be hard to locate when I start having problems. So at least if we use change management, we'll look through the log and see, well, what was changed last. Then we can go back and undo that. Problem solved very quickly. You start making changes without logging them, then it's going to take days to figure out what's wrong with the network. That's why it's important to have these change management policies in place. Remember, this is key, monitoring any resource requires system resources. So monitor your network, but don't monitor anything you're not going to actually use. So don't turn on a system that's going to monitor or log everything that somebody does unless you're going to go back and check that log later. If you do, then you're just wasting your resources. Remember, everything, any logging I turn on is going to impact my performance. Remember, we talked about controls and operations. Any one of these controls you put in place is going to take a bite out of your operations. Let's move on to the next slide. Remember change management. LAN control should only allow traffic from valid addresses. Right? So an example would be maybe in my router, right, or in my firewall. That's typically how we control what information gets in and out of the network. If I'm on a router, I should not be switching or routing packets that come from the um, test networks or forwarding packets that come from test networks. If a router receives a packet from the TEN network, it shouldn't be forwarded in anywhere. Unless you're using NAT or something like that, then that's a different case. But if somebody tries to initiate connection to your server from the internet and the source address is at a 10.x.x.x network, your router shouldn't be doing anything with that. Right? Your router should not be receiving information on addresses um, from internal addresses from the outside interface. So, for example, I might use the 150.200.x.x network. That's inside of my company. I shouldn't be receiving packets from 150.200.x.x on the interface that's connected to the internet. Setting up those simple rules in your router will stop people from performing spoofing attacks. We should not allow traffic out of our router to the internet that doesn't come from one of our internal address ranges. That's an example of this LAN configuration. So when you're talking about your LAN controls, think about what makes sense. What should a router be doing? What should a router not be doing? The routing rules. We need to make sure that we know when routing rules are changed. Somebody gets in one of our routers, they can forward all of our traffic out to a router on the outside or on the perimeter and then forward it back, do a man-in-the-middle attack. So we need to know when the routing rules change. If somebody gets in there and fools around with our routing protocol, they could route all of our traffic through their device and eavesdrop on us. We need to know when it was changed, who changed them, and why they changed them. That's why we need to have the change review or change management policy. So that's part of that. You need to have a control board, which is a group of people that approve each change to the network. Only a small number of people should be able to actually make those changes. And they shouldn't be on the control board. So that's separation of duties, right? So the people that approve the changes should not be able to make the changes. They should have to get someone else to make it. All right. And reason we use that control is to, if they want to bypass one of the controls, then they would have to have collusion. We're going to set up syslog, and we're going to have log entries anytime we change the configuration settings, who changed it in the firewall. The benefits from this change procedure will limit unexpected changes to your network, and it'll provide an audit trail when changes allow unwanted traffic into your network. It might not be intentional, it might be an accident. Well, if it's an accident, then we need to retrain that person. Make sense? So we need to have LAN management tools also that monitor our network performance. We need to have change configuration management so we can tell when things have been changed, and we can put those changes into effect, and we can optimize our performance. Think of quality of service. So we want our voice over IP traffic to get across our network before our email traffic. We can do things like that. We can monitor our network. We can find there's always a way to make your network better. So we can do that. We just need to have these controls in place. We need to be able to add necessary controls to address security issues. There's always going to be new security issues. The latest security issues that are out there now are SolarWinds And there's a big Exchange server security issue right now. We also have what's that? Silver Sparrow with the Macs. So as these threats come about, we need to be able to change our controls and adapt. We need to make sure that we have spare components, spare switches, spare routers, so that we can have a recovery process that gets people up as quickly as possible. So maybe we can talk to the business people and say, hey, when we buy this switch, let's buy 2 of them. In case one goes bad, we'll have one on hand to replace it with. We also need to always have a current map of the network. We need to know what should be on there, what should not be on. That's one of the foundations of maturity of your controls and your information security, is having a list of authorized and unauthorized devices. So that's one of the bedrock foundations of the security, is knowing what components are on your LAN. Remember, we're going to have an access control system on our LAN that's going to enforce, after a user authenticates themselves, what they can do on routers and switches and on your LAN, and it's also going to monitor what they do. We also need to talk about stuff like authentication of devices. So not only do we authenticate users on our network, we're going to authenticate devices. So an example would be in your switches, what we're going to do is use the port security. So in port security, what we're going to do is we know the list of MAC addresses that should be allowed on our network. So if somebody plugs in a device that doesn't belong on our network, the switch will deactivate the port. That's an example of this authentication of a machine. That can be pretty easily bypassed by spoofing somebody's MAC address. So we have even more technically involved solutions to authenticate computers on the network, such as using PKI and certificates on the devices, digital certificates. So we just need to think about all of that when we create our network. We need to authenticate devices as well as users, because we talked about user authentication in the user domain. Now we're talking about the LAN domain. We need to be able to identify devices and see them. We even have NAC, which is that Network Admission Control, and that allows us to make sure that the computers that are connected to our network are healthy. They have antivirus running. They have all of their security patches. That's what we're talking about, access controls and access rights in the LAN domain. We're talking about authenticating devices. That is possible. And again, all of these controls are going to support the CIA triad. Confidentiality, making sure that only authorized users can access information. It's going to support integrity, making sure that only authorized users can make changes to our information. And availability, that the systems are available to legitimate users when they need to be available. Here are some controls that we can use to support the CIA. One thing we're going to do with confidentiality is make sure that we identify the user and also identify the sensitivity of information. So that's part of identification also. We're going to identify our confidential data by putting top secret on it, a security label. or we can say sensitive or internal use only. We can put stamps on information to classify it. And then we're going to require people to identify themselves and prove who they are once when they try to access the information. So we're going to have authorization. The person's going to prove who they are, and then the system's going to look and make sure that they are authorized to access that information. We're also going to use encryption on the network to store the data. We're also going to use encryption to transmit the data. It's two different systems. Encryption, when you're storing the data, would be like BitLocker or encrypted file system on Windows. Encryption while it's in transit would be IPsec or some VPN protocol. So we need to make sure that we're keeping confidentiality when the data is being processed, when it's at rest, and when the data is in flight or being transmitted. Controls that support integrity would be policies and procedures. We talked about that a lot in the user domain. So, you know, who can have, we have policies, procedures, who can modify the information. Anti-malware, to make sure that we're not getting viruses on our network that's corrupting our operating systems, that's corrupting our data. People don't get in and change information they shouldn't be able to change. And then we have controls for availability. That would be backups, having predetermined recovery plans, and then again, access controls, who can get to the information. Also, what access controls when we're thinking about availability is only allowing access to our servers from legitimate computers, so we don't have denial of service attacks going on. So if we can take a pool of computers and say these are the computers that should be accessing that system, and then block all the other connections, then we don't have as much problem with denial of service. So that a denial of service attack is an attack on availability. So we need access controls to be able to control the traffic in and out of our network. So remember, we have these three buckets that we put our controls in: preventative, detective, and corrective. Preventative prevents an attack from taking place or succeeding. Detective tells us when an attack has succeeded, and then corrective makes actions to fix the breach or the result of the attack. So in the LAN domain, examples of preventative controls would be, like I said, control computer-based authentication. So it prevents anybody that has a dirty computer that has viruses on it or doesn't have their patches from connecting to the network. It also prevents unknown users from connecting to our network. That's a preventative control, the network admission control. The change control policy, right? The change review board is going to be a preventative control. It's going to prevent somebody from taking down the network by putting a bad configuration into one of your routers. Encryption is going to stop people from stealing data or eavesdropping on data. So encryption is considered a preventative control. Detective controls on our network would be auditing. So anytime somebody accesses an object or a file, then that security principal is going to have their name put in a list somewhere where they've accessed it. That's a detective control. We can find out what happened after the fact. Performance monitoring. Performance monitoring doesn't prevent attacks. It lets us know that the network is degraded. It detects it. Packet analysis is also detective control, allows us to detect what happened on the network. Remember, detective is after the fact. Corrective controls would be examples for the LAN domain would be operating system and patching, operating system patching and application patching on our systems. That's going to correct holes, or maybe after an attack we say, oh, we should have had this patch on there. We're going to put a patch on there. Okay. Wrapping it up, these are the best practices for your LAN domain. What we're going to do is create a map of the LAN before installing hardware. So this is ideal. We're going to go in a place, the network isn't there, we're going to create the network, and we're going to document everything from the beginning. If we can do that, that's the best thing. If not, we can go and there's software we can use to map the network and map all the devices on there. But we need to know what should be on our network. We also need to know what's on our network so we can identify things that shouldn't be there. Implement a single sign-on strategy. This is what I was talking about, centralized authentication, so that we don't have 50 different passwords for 50 different systems. We have one place that's kind of the gatekeeper for all of our information. What that looks like on a network would be something like Kerberos, where we're using Active Directory to have a single point, a domain controller where they can process log-on information. Identify critical resources and establish detailed access controls. So this is part of the threat analysis. We're going to figure out what our business critical resources are, and then we're going to establish some kind of access control system to control who can get to it. Make sure you have a backup and recovery plan. Make sure that we're doing updates for all of our systems and patching. Remember, we have controls that we can use to test the patches also before they put in production. Make sure your routing and filtering rules on your firewalls only allow necessary traffic. B, have a paranoid posture, not a permissive posture. What I mean by that is use whitelist instead of blacklist. Blacklist is I find a problem and then I don't let that on my network anymore. A whitelist is everything's blocked until I decide to let it through. You want to have that paranoid posture where you're blocking everything and then slowly you open it up and allow things that you want in. That would be an example of these filtering rules. Also, make sure you're monitoring your traffic for performance and for suspicious content. So we should have intrusion detection systems going, and if a virus crosses my network, I should get an alert about that. I should also be monitoring my performance to make sure we don't have 20 people watching Netflix. Our network is a limited resource, and if it's slow into a crawl because people are streaming video, we need to address that. Make sure you have control management in, that we carefully control any changes to the network, the configuration on the network. Make sure you turn auditing on things that you're going to review, right? Items of interest. I'm not going to say turn on auditing on everything. Remember, it'll slow our system down. What we want to do is find items of interest that would be important to us and audit those things. It's always best to use automated tools. Sometimes they're expensive, but sometimes they pay, right? They pay off having them. So we have automated tools to map, configure, monitor, and manage the LAN domain. A big part of that is using Active Directory. Look into Active Directory if you don't use Active Directory. If your components support active attack intervention, configure services to terminate connections when a suspected attack is in progress. That would be an intrusion prevention system, or an IPS. When it detects an attack, it'll break the connection and shut down a port. So again, today we've covered how why we need to have compliance in the LAN domain. We talked about different types of controls that support the CIA triad. We talked about different policy standards, procedures, and guidelines you should have in place. Talked about vulnerability management, making sure that we are continually improving our network and closing security vulnerabilities. And then we talked about best practices for this domain. I'm glad you could listen to this and join me today. If you have any questions, send me email, and have a great week.